Call the meeting to order for the June 27th, 2019 City of Albany Traffic and Safety Commission. If we can start with the roll call.
Commissioner Davendell.
Present.
Commissioner Paulson.
Here.
Chair Del Rosario.
Present. Okay, item 2 is public comment. This is for anyone who wants to comment on an item that is not on the agenda. Okay, come on up.
My name is Bob Fierce. I live at 761 Pierce Street near Washington. And we have a parking problem like everybody else in Albany. We have to park on the sidewalks, and it's always kind of a jockeying position as to who parks in front of whose house. We could probably accept 5 more cars in our neighborhood if we had to, but 10 would be stretching it. 20 new cars on our block would be a lot. 40? How about 40? Well, the city council is about to approve, I believe, a 60-unit apartment complex at the corner of Cleveland and Washington. They've required only 1 parking spot per unit, which means could be 60 additional cars from that development looking for places to park in our neighborhood. As you know, of course, any residence is required to have 2 off-street parking units. Below market value, they've requested only 1 unit, 1 parking space per unit. So I was just wondering if you guys have thought this through as to what 60 additional cars could mean for our neighborhood and what might be a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could you fill out a speaker card so we have your comment for public record? You're going to get one in the back there by those pens. Okay. Any other public comment? Okay, seeing none.
Yeah, I would just note there were some emails directed to the new email address directly to the commissioners. Those were posted for the agenda under public comment, and you received those directly from those.
Thank you. Okay. Item 3, presentations, 3-1, monthly police data on collisions and citations.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll note Commissioner Jordan has arrived for the record. The pedestrian collisions for the month of May were none. Bicycle collisions, there was 1 recorded. Vehicle collisions were 17, 5 of which were injury collisions in the month of May. And moving citations issued by the police department were 80. And there were 4 DUI arrests. And the police department always sends this qualification with it, which I haven't said in the past, so I'll say it periodically just as a reminder. This is preliminary data collected during the period in which information is still being updated and subject to change. So we'll be discussing collision data later in the agenda, and probably if you lined up these charts, you're not going to see exact matches.
Okay. Thanks. Any questions or comments from Commission? I did have a question on or maybe just more of an observation on the moving citations. It looks like from February to May, it shot up from below 20 to 80, which seems to be the biggest jump. And I don't know if there is a reason for that, but it just seems different from what we're seeing in the past.
Yeah, there's at least 1 data point on the way up in between, but I yeah, I'm not familiar with specific reasons the citations have increased.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none. Let's go to 3-2, shared mobility data.
So we didn't have the data last month, so I'm reporting 2 months worth of data here. So gig saw members increase 363 in April and 380 in May, and the trips increased to 982 in April and 1,118 in May. It was starting to get a little dense on the chart, so the table, so I've switched to visual representation of this. The one addition they noted is they're extending their in-app prohibition on ending trips in the 90-minute zone. Previously, they had excluded Solano from being able to end your trip because of our 90-minute prohibition. It wasn't as big of an issue, but they've now added in San Pablo because we have the similar 90-minute zones on San Pablo. And Lime scooters continued to increase, saw 158 trips in May following 83 trips in April. And I looked a little more closely at the day by day. It ranges 0 to 7 through day by day up because they're not being replaced here. They get moved elsewhere each day when they get rebalanced. So that's the fluctuation.
And can you remind me again how the trip is measured? Is it as a destination or an origin?
Destination or origin in Albany.
Do we know if they've started to, they're not putting scooters in Albany, correct? But have they started in El Cerrito or Berkeley? Do we know? Or?
They have not.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, data? All right, on to the consent calendar. Do we have any items that the commission or the public wants to discuss on consent?
Yeah, an adjustment. Nope, sorry. Possible adjustment to the minutes, which is under the item regarding encroachment. Last statement. Slow here. The last statement of paragraph says, however, this approach is not equitable for all property owners because public property is not available for all property owners. I think I was the one that said something about that, and I actually said the converse, that it would be equitable because public property is not available to all property owners.
I think you're holding your mic off.
Yeah. Oh, hold on. Okay, thank you. Sorry. That's not helpful.
Censored.
So if I switch it the other way, then it's...
I think it is, right?
Okay, yep. Red light is on. Okay, good, thank you. So this last sentence, however, this approach is not equitable for all property owners because public property is not available for all property owners. If I was the one that said that, I actually would have said the converse, which is that it is equitable to charge an ongoing fee for structural encroachments, specifically because public property is not available to all property owners. In other words, if you let some property owners encroach without a fee, that's not an amenity that the city can provide uniformly to each and every property owner in the city. And then on 4.2, we had a message from Commissioner McCroskey, who's not here.
Yes, on the timing.
Yeah, and on this on the school. There's actually, yeah, okay. And so I thought his questions were well-formed. I thought it would be useful to suggest that the commission ask that those questions be forwarded to the school board or school district. Maybe that was going to happen anyway. I don't know. And then maybe also add the question, which I don't think was in there, and I don't know what their latest thinking is, but they had some thought of having a drop-off zone that was just to the east of the turnaround on Portland. So where Pomona comes into Portland and there's a turnaround, they were thinking of blocking off a couple of the angled parking spaces just to the east of there on the north side. And so what came up last time we discussed this was, well, the school district is going to need to take some measures so that people aren't just continually making U-turns right there in the street. So that would be the other question, is what are they going to do if they are still thinking of putting in that loading zone? What measures are they going to implement to try to prevent, hundreds of people from making a U-turn right there, just beyond the 4 or 3-way stop?
Any other questions or comments on the consent calendar?
I'll move approval of the consent calendar with the adjustments to the minutes.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none. Let's go to discussion items. 5-1, Ohlone Greenway Trail Safety Improvements at Masonic, Marin Avenue, and Masonic Avenue and Solano Avenue intersections.
Thank you, Chair. This item entails improvements at 2 signalized intersections, Masonic Marin and Masonic Solano. The primary goal for the project is to improve the Ohlone Greenway crossings at these intersections, making it safer for Greenway users. Other considerations for the design include pedestrian safety at other intersection legs, bicycle facilities and routes on Marin and Masonic, intersection approaches and the related intersection movements, motorist movement, and compliance at the intersection, arterial motorist capacity on Marin and Solano, and potential parking impacts. The staff memo details the background for this item in discussing the history on the more recent changes in the lane configuration at the intersections in association with the Masonic Avenue ATP project. I forgot to mention the other ATP project that's relevant, which is the Ohlone Greenway Crossing Enhancements, which identifies many of the elements in the concept you'll see tonight. The city has secured grant funding toward this project, and we want to discuss conceptual designs tonight and prepare to proceed into detailed design on this. Andrew Lee with Parisi Transportation Consulting will present the concept and analysis of alternatives and will be available to answer questions.
I thought I put a photo on that. Okay, surprise. Good evening, Commissioners. Andrew Lee with Parisi Transportation Consulting. We are one of the city's on-call transportation engineers, and we assisted the city with the grant application for this project, which was ultimately awarded funds through the cycle, I think four active transportation planning grant. Tonight I'm going to cover some of the conceptual details that were included in the application, and then talk about the revised study and revalidation that we've undergone to see whether there's additional refinements that could improve the design to fit the objectives of the project. Okay, so as Justin mentioned, these improvements were originally identified within the city for inclusion in the Capital Improvements Program in 2018. They were applied for ATP funding and ultimately awarded northward of $400,000 through that program. And in this current task, we are revalidating the scope of the improvements in order to inform the detailed design and ultimate construction. So there's 2 intersections that are going to be within the scope of the improvements. The first one being at Masonic and Marin, the second at Masonic and Solano. This illustration here is the proposed improvement as applied for in the ATP grant application. And I'll just highlight for you that the signal upgrades are for the addition of a protected left turn or left turn arrow phase in the southbound direction, which is intended to improve the safety of people in the Ohlone Greenway, because right now, as the Ohlone Greenway and North and South Masonic get the green light, People walking and bicycling on the Greenway are subject to some matter of conflict to both northbound right-turning vehicles and southbound left-turning vehicles. So the idea here is to improve the traffic signal to ultimately upgrade the controller. The existing equipment's a bit old, and the controller, the software, the hardware has a hard time providing these additional phases that you're seeing at a lot of other newer signals. So some of the improvements, in addition to adding the left turn phase that we would like to include, are the leading pedestrian interval, which is where people in the crosswalks get a lead of 3 to 4 seconds prior to the parallel vehicle traffic getting the green light. You'll also notice here that there are striping upgrades recommended, and in particular for Masonic and Marin, bulb outs with the caveat of where feasible. And I'll get a little bit deeper into that. Masonic and Marin being a particular case for proposal on bulb outs because there are no existing bulb outs there now, and there are no conflicts with any bus routes or any bus stops in the immediate area, and this is not the case for Solano. I'm going to flip over here and also show, per the ATP grant application, the darkened arrows, which represent the traffic signals at the southwest corner. That is where a new traffic signal pole and mast arm would be installed to provide a left turn arrow phase. The one thing about these improvements here, you'll notice, is that it's actually asymmetrical because we're not proposing the same improvements in the northbound traffic facing direction. And so it does accomplish the immediate goals of protecting Ohlone Greenway pathway users from the southbound left turn phase, but in the northbound direction, people driving would still be subject to only seeing a green ball and yielding to oncoming traffic and then turning whenever there is a gap, both in traffic and also in the crosswalk on the west side of the street. I'm just going to move over to Solano and just talk about the improvements there, but the ATP concept as proposed is very similar to what was proposed at Marin and Masonic, which is to modify primarily the southbound approach to provide a left turn pocket and to provide a protected left turn signal for southbound traffic. Again, it's got the same limitations of being an asymmetrical system and not necessarily providing the same degree of priority for people walking in, primarily walking, but possibly also biking on the west crosswalks. So with that concept as part of the baseline, we went to a revalidation process to see what sort of refinements that we could implement. And so some of the alternatives that you noticed in the staff report, the first alternative was to see if we could get any benefit from providing a left turn pocket in the northbound direction, but not providing a left turn signal. And this would result in a few benefits, namely one that it is a more symmetrical approach and provides a queuing area for northbound left turning vehicles. But it does have a particular deficiency, which is if you don't have the corresponding signal in the northbound direction, somebody waiting in the left turn pocket sees somebody waiting in a southbound left turn pocket, and then the southbound traffic goes, and then some people may get the mistaken impression that, oh, they're going, I should go, and maybe not pay attention, and results in a crash. So that is one concept that we analyzed. It provides some minor benefit, but I think there's certain deficiencies as well in having an asymmetrical design. So then the alternative 3 that we also analyzed would provide the similar new signal mast arm also on the northbound approach, for the northbound approach. So you would take the signals as proposed for the southwest corner and replicate them on the northeast corner. And so that would provide left turn signal phasing in both of these directions. And it does provide several benefits as well. So number one, it's a symmetrical control scheme for Masonic, northbound and southbound direction. And then it also has a benefit of providing an opportunity for a leading pedestrian interval for the Ohlone Greenway, so that actually the very first phase for the north and southbound traffic can actually be the Ohlone Greenway traffic, which is kind of subtle. You didn't actually get that in the previous alternatives, and I'll go into the reasons why. But under a alternative 3 concept, which unfortunately I apologize we didn't draw up, the northbound traffic would get the left turn phase. We would hold the northbound through traffic as part of the leading interval and allow the Ohlone Greenway traffic to go. And then as the northbound traffic clears, we stop the northbound left, allow the southbound through traffic to go, and then ultimately when we stop the Ohlone Greenway phase, then the southbound left turn phasing can go. So you're provided a degree of protection for people walking and bicycling in both of the north and south crossing crosswalks. The thing about the first alternative was that for the Ohlone Greenway traffic, it would always have to follow the initial southbound left turn. We originally thought, oh, it would be nice if actually we could let the Ohlone Greenway users go first and go with a lagging protected left turn. But interestingly, it results in this situation called a yellow trap, which is if we provided the green ball for both north and southbound traffic and allowed the Ohlone Greenway users to go, and then the northbound traffic would have to stop, so they'd see a red light, and this is in order to provide the opportunity for southbound left-turning vehicles to go. But for most users, if they see the red ball, they presume that the opposing direction also has the red phase, and so a lot of people will get through on the yellow or on the red if they're already entered in the intersection. But under an asymmetrical system like that, the southbound traffic would still get the green phase. So that is a deficiency in the asymmetrical approach, and it would not provide the same degree of priority for the Ohlone Greenway users. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the proposed refinements then, as recommended in our revalidation, a left turn signal for northbound Masonic traffic, and so therefore there would also be new traffic signal poles at the southwest corner and the northeast corner. Something that we didn't actually include but is possible is that we could add more pedestrian lighting, because with the mast arm poles we could also include pedestrian scale lighting on top of those poles. Saves us a bit of money on that. And then in conversation with staff, design adjustments for bicycle movements to and from Marin and Solano. So we understand that Marin, for instance, has intersecting bicycle facilities, bike lanes. The Solano Complete Street project may be introducing some form of bicycle facility. So there are some movements where people are going to be intersecting east and west and trying to turn either on or off the Ohlone Greenway. So we do have some opportunities for the bulb out design to include ways to accommodate that. One thing that I'm showing in the picture here is this is the existing southwest corner at Marin and Masonic, where the roadway grade was actually raised to meet the sidewalk grade, and that provides for a nice flattened area without as many curbs, so that somebody approaching from an intersecting street could get onto or off of the Ohlone Greenway if they so desired. There are a few matters that we're going to be studying in detail design related to the bulb outs, namely large vehicle movements, and there is one deficiency about this particular design, which is if we raise the if we raise the roadway grade to the sidewalk grade, large vehicles tend to track over bulb outs if they don't swing out wide enough, and the lack of raised curbs, for instance, results in sometimes some encroachment by large vehicles. So we're going to have to balance those two competing issues of, one, accommodation for turns on and off the Ohlone Greenway versus large vehicle tracking and bulb outs, and then also with the drainage of the street. So when we go into detailed design, there will be topographic surveys and runoff analyses, and also more engagement with the city fire department to make sure that they're comfortable with the way the bulb outs are laid out. Okay, so regarding next steps, like I just said, bulb out design is going to be accounting for drainage and turn templates, particularly at Marin. At both of these intersections, we'll be looking at the signal and lighting design to see what parts of the existing signal equipment can be salvaged or retained and which parts need to be upgraded. But we are anticipating at least those signal mast arms and the signal cabinets and controllers and the associated software related to that. And then further refinements to the signal timing. We are assuming the protected phasing for Masonic traffic and also leading pedestrian intervals for both the crosswalks, and then additional refinements to the signing and stripage. Striping and signage. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. Questions from the commission?
So no additional bulb outs are proposed at Solano and Masonic. Am I correct in that, understanding that? Okay, thanks.
And that's due to whatever will happen with the Complete Streets project, correct?
With the Complete Streets project, and also that there are existing bus stops, AC Transit bus stops, and I think the Complete Street project is going to sort out whether there may be any movement in the existing bus stop locations.
And I believe the Complete Streets project has bus bulb outs, I think. They do at the stops. I thought every stop was bulbed out.
Yeah, I can't recall actually what's under the BART tracks there.
Yeah, so part of the rationale is the Complete Streets calls for in-lane boarding. It also calls for some proposals at the adjoining key route connection there. So I think looking at the curb lines for that whole thing should be done in concert versus as part of this project.
I don't know if you have the turning template handy.
I do. I don't have all of them. I only have the fire truck turning one.
Oh, okay. It was actually but I think it's similar enough. So the SU turning movement from westbound Marin to northbound Masonic concerned me because it basically is what's shown there. The SU had to take the left turn lane to make that turn. And I don't know if SUs are legally allowed. I mean, on Marin, no, but inevitably I'm sure they're there, at least for some
Unless they're amazingly lightweight, weight limit.
What is the weight limit?
5 or 3 tons? It's 5.
Okay. And so I was wondering if the bulb out on the Masonic side was eliminated, how much could that help with that movement so that the SUs didn't have to fully occupy the left turn lane in order to make the turn?
Yeah, I think it would help to a small degree. With the lane reconfiguration, I think the center line isn't moving by very much, but it might by a little. So I think that's something that we're going to be revisiting in detailed design. The widening of the bulb outs into Masonic in terms of relative priorities a little bit less just because that crossing's shorter by quite a bit compared to the Marin crossing. And so I think that is a possible trade-off that we've identified to not bulb into Masonic there.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering that because there's a very long green phase on Marin and it's a short crossing, so definitely not as critical. All right, thank you. I was also wondering about the possibility of intertying this signal or having this signal, essentially the offspring of the phasing of the signal at San Pablo. So we kind of have a problem at San Pablo with the last project that was done, that it's choked the lanes down so far that there's sort of a throughput problem westbound. So, and I, total novice here, one thought I had was if those vehicles were actually moving when they hit that signal on a green, maybe there'd be more throughput. Because at least what I observe is the 2 lanes westbound on Marin at San Paulo clear pretty quickly. And then there's a, 1 lane feeding into it, and the gaps open up pretty wide between the motorists who are trying to make it through behind that because they're coming off of a start. So I don't know if they were able to hit that, going 25, then maybe you would get more vehicles through. I don't know. And I don't know if that is the case. I don't know if these 2 signals could be tied together in that way. I don't know if the signal cycle at San Pablo, is so different from what the signal cycle would be here that they just can't be timed together or not. But anyway, that was another question. I guess more of a statement, but also a question because I don't know. So if you have any initial thoughts offhand or reactions or.
Yeah, let's see. The signal at Solano and San Pablo's got a few issues. It runs on a much longer cycle length. I think it's in the 120-something cycle. And as we analyzed it, this being a smaller intersection, fewer phases, generally shorter cycle, I think we had it somewhere in the 80 to 90-second phase. So if you did want to have coordination as a matter of principle, the cycle length here would have to be extended so that they were of compatible multiples, or if not, the same exact cycle length. If there isn't the traffic to fill that green time, then it is an annoyance at the very least. But that said, other issues with Solano at San Pablo, the east and west phases are running what we traffic engineers call split phasing, where it's all westbound and then it's all eastbound. And I know the city has been talking to Caltrans about trying to get that changed to a phase where it could shorten things down to provide the left turn phasing separate from the through movements, which could truncate the phase times. And so that in that instance may help the throughput probably more so than coordination for that matter. One more thing.
So if I could just jump in, and I may well have misspoke because I know I'm prone to do that. I was actually focusing on Marin,
Okay.
not Solano.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I might have said Solano and meant Marin because I know I do that. So.
Okay, sorry about that. So you're talking about whether coordinating the throughput on Marin being
problematic with the recent reconfiguration, yeah.
Yeah, that's an entirely different beast.
Sorry about that if I misspoke. Did I misspeak just for my own feedback?
Solano in the beginning, then you switched over to.
Okay, my apologies.
Okay. That one is an 8-phase signal, and it isn't running on splits. Sorry, trying to recalibrate here. I think what I mentioned before about compatible cycle lengths.
Still apply, yeah.
Yeah, and then I also wonder, there's several non-signalized intersections in between, and it's kind of a matter of like if there are, for instance, people in the crosswalk, the benefits of.
Throws it off, yeah.
It's thrown off,
Yeah, okay. Thank you for entertaining that and my misfire.
Other questions?
Just one question, comment about the bulb outs with respect to if you raise the street up to make it a continuous curb ramp essentially, and having vehicles track over that. With respect to the new signal poles, would you put those in the same place or would you pull them out further? Because obviously with a big steel pole there, cars and trucks are going to try to avoid going over because they don't want to crash into it. At the same time, as the pole comes out, there's more chance of it getting hit. Is that something you've given much consideration to at this point, or are you going to look at that later?
I did see that. I mean, there's an existing pole that's in the middle of the curb ramp at, I think, Marin southeast corner, where it's fairly close to the edge of the street there. And I would rather recess the poles back rather than using them as a traffic bollard.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And we're also going to have to try to make sure that the equipment's compatible so that new poles don't conflict with existing poles, because we try to build these signals in parallel to keep the existing equipment running while we're putting up new equipment. So they're not going to be in the same place. And then we have to see where the utilities are, so it gets complicated.
Although that pole's not one of the ones, that one might not move, right?
That one's not supposed to move.
Yeah, okay.
Questions?
I've got a few questions. So with the left turn signal, it would be a green arrow and then there'd be a red arrow as well? Okay. Would Ohlone pedestrians be crossing the street at the same time as the western leg? Would they be running across the street? Would pedestrians be crossing at the same time or no?
Pedestrians in the Ohlone Greenway going north and south would be going at the same time as northbound Masonic traffic and northbound left-turning Masonic traffic.
Okay. Can you clarify? I was confused about, there was a discussion about parking being removed to accommodate. Can you clarify where those spaces would be?
Yeah, a couple things about that. So let's see. The proposal to provide the left turn pocket in both directions would require striping them out a certain distance. I think we recommended about 100 feet. And let me see here.
I can speak to that too. So.
Okay. Go ahead and jump in.
I did look a little closer at the parking side of that, so I can pull that up. But the extension so at Marin and Masonic, the extension to 100 feet affects a loading zone that's outside the community center. And we communicated with community center staff, and they've identified their use of the loading zone. It would be a little less convenient to move it north of the 100 feet, but not impractical for them. So they see the benefits of the intersection safety improvements. They identified the issues that they see. So they use the loading for the rental space and the community center primarily. That's one of the selling points of being able to quickly set up, and caterers use it as well as staff uses it. But there's a space. Let me pull this up. So the loading zone currently, switch. The loading zone solidly within the 100 feet, that would be extending the bays for the alternative 3, but there is space to the north of that before the red stripe that should serve their needs. It doesn't have the back of a truck right at their door anymore, but it's not that far, and it seems like it would serve their purposes, but we'd look in greater detail once we have things mapped out a little closer. But that's my initial assessment. There would be a parking space removed for the loading zone to move is essentially the impact there. The impact at Solano is...
We need to
so
parking on the southern...
So the loading zone would move to this stretch outside the 100 feet. They don't need it for large trucks. It's like catering trucks. And
would this be the only parking change, or would on the southern portion of the intersection would we need to change?
So So the queuing impact, because it is a lagging left turn southbound, is greater. So they identified just the southbound bays needing to extend to the 100 feet. So that's the impact there, not an impact in the northbound direction, because they get the leading left. The concern is that the queuing left vehicles queue up far enough to block through traffic, and so no one gets through during the rest of that phase. At Solano, because this isn't currently striped to have the 2 lanes, we only striped 3 of the 4 approaches when we resurfaced. This one, sees a greater impact because it doesn't currently have the 60, 65 feet in bays now. But if we striped what the current plan is, that would still be the impact of implementing what the design is at the other approaches. But there is an existing loading zone. It's not, so I spoke to the owner of the gallery. He's not very supportive of this for the parking impacts, but he doesn't rely on the loading zone. Most of his artists are small artists and, don't have a big vehicle to unload art. They just have a passenger vehicle.
I see a lot of UPS trucks.
Yeah, so I spoke to some UPS truck drivers that are out there regularly. They actually use this stretch to load from multiple vehicles onto a vehicle that goes to the airport to get it on a plane. So I'm not sure exactly what to do with their, transferring needs and the use of Masonic for that. There is currently the green zone that their use in the afternoon probably does conflict with the child pickup. So I think there is some shared use of it to date, but it probably is also conflicting times as well. But the extension to so putting in the 65 feet would impact the yellow loading zone and one of the parking spaces. Extension to 100 feet impacts another parking space on the north side of the driveway. So they see it as if we did put the loading zone somewhere else, you're potentially impacting 4 spaces, but just going to the 100 feet is 2 general use spaces and the loading zone. We have to wait till we do more detailed design, but there also is the potential to tighten up the lane widths and not have as much red curb on the outgoing stretches of these. So we currently, because we have 2 lanes on the approach, the exiting approach is red curbed. So not in this example because it's not striped, but across from the community center, there's red curb while it's 2 southbound lanes and 1 northbound lane. But it's 18 feet, and if we have a 10-foot lane and an 8-foot parking strip, you wouldn't necessarily need to red curb that. So while I don't want to promise that at this stage, there is the potential that we would be able to, balance out some of the loss.
And then I just have just one more question. So for the bike lanes in Masonic, those would go away. And I saw that there were counts, bike counts. Did we get a distinction between Ohlone bikes and there was a distinction? I didn't notice.
There was. I might have this slide.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't have that slide, so
It's okay.
there was a distinction in the counts.
Okay.
I can report back afterwards.
It's behind you now.
Pulling it up.
Oh, there you go.
So we did count, Greenway and other bikes separately.
So if I'm reading that right, there were 105 on the Greenway and 81 going in all other 3 or 4 directions on the road?
Yes.
Okay. And we don't know how many of those 81 in that 2 hours were going east-west on Marin versus north-south on Masonic?
No, I was tracking pedestrian.
Yeah, okay.
Pedestrian at different approaches mainly, so I was counting them, but I was not distinguishing all the various bicycle movements because, there was a lot of
Nicely done.
possibilities.
I was thinking about who was doing this when I was looking at it, going, wow, their head was spinning around.
So the other, I don't have my glasses on, I'm sorry. So the Greenway and then the next to the right of it, that's?
Other bikes were either on Masonic or on Marin,
Okay.
moving through the intersection.
Just a pull out just of, okay. I was
So-
just curious.
So I've done counts on a screen line south of Washington,
Okay.
just south of Washington, so an east-west screen line across Masonic and the Greenway. And I don't remember what the counts were, but about 20% of people were biking on Masonic and 80% were biking on the Greenway, just to give you a feel for the split. I don't know if that's what it is now. That was in 2012, I think.
And this was near the end of school. The Solano numbers were a little higher, and I don't know if that was because it was approaching the end of school or Solano traffic has more of a catchment than Marin. But these are the similar Solano numbers.
Questions? I had two questions. One is we had a member of the public ask us about converting, I think it was like a year ago, some time ago, converting the intersection, I believe it was Solano and Masonic, to PED recall instead of actuation. And I think because of the signal hardware, we didn't have the flexibility to do both. It was going to be one or the other. So do we get that ability with the signal upgrades to convert over to actuation and off peaks and recall on the peaks, or whatever it is that we want to do?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And then my other question was, it looks like there's, I think, $410,000 for available funding for this. And I mean, it's pretty preliminary, but will those costs be all covered in all the alternatives with the amount of money available?
Yeah, I think the striping mod in the northbound approach is relatively small in terms of cost. So the bigger cost item is going to be the new traffic signal pole facing northbound traffic, and they generally run, I want to say, about between $25,000 and $40,000. They're not the jumbo-sized poles because the intersection is not that wide, so the foundation doesn't have to go quite as deep. But for two locations, I guess you're looking at somewhere in the order of $50,000 to maybe $80,000 additional.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, on the bulb out on the north side of Marin, in the passenger turning template, because I'm nervous about creating another problem there for motorists. So right now it's rarely parked up, and it's essentially used as an informal right turn lane. And so I was always nervous about adding a bulb out at that location that you could end up blocking through motorists. I mean, they probably would go around and, sweep into the edge of the left turn lane. But I'm concerned about the bulb out on both sides of that corner in terms of what it does to capacity and turning movements. Has this configuration been run through Synchro?
Yeah, we did run it through Synchro. We did a level of service analysis. The existing condition on a intersection average is what we'd call a level of service B, which is somewhere in delay in the order of like 20 seconds for all approaches and all vehicles. And then with the additional protected left turn phasing, it goes up to level of service C, which is, I think, like sub 35 seconds. I think it was closer still in like the 25 to 30 second range. So there's a minor matter of additional delay. Synchro is not as specific as we'd like it to be for matters of like fine movements of like where the bulb outs are, or where there's like lane narrowing. So I don't really think it picks up on the nuances of that. But the turning movements at the intersection are they're not huge, even during the peak hour.
Right, but it only takes one motorist stuck there waiting for a group to cross Masonic. And if they're blocking through traffic, then that is really going to foul up that whole signal cycle. So do you think that I think what I saw in that, and again, it's on the screen now, so the P turning template, I mean, it looks like the vehicle can still pull over out of the way into the cycling lane. So is that because the bulb out is not extending? I mean, what is the bulb out dimension? Is it coming out like a full 7 feet, like a full parallel parking space, or is it something less than that?
We usually do 6 feet.
Okay.
So that it's not the full shadow of a parked vehicle, but something slightly less than that.
Okay. So I guess maybe that's why it works, because the cycling lane there, I think, is 6.5 feet. So then you get 7.5 feet, and what an average passenger vehicle is 6 feet, 6.5 feet. So in your professional opinion, if that bulb out was built given what's shown there, if there was a stack up of right-turning motorists, or even one right-turning motorist who was having to wait for the crosswalk to clear, would that or would that not interfere with through movement?
It would interfere with the through movement to a slight degree. I don't see the entire phase being blocked up based on the numbers of pedestrians that we're seeing. There may be some instances during, say, right before school where there are a lot of people coming through, but the idea, especially with the longer cycle length, is that they're all going to accumulate prior to getting the green cycle, and then they should get through the intersection as one large group, as a platoon, rather than proceeding, say, single file and occupying the entire green phase. So small risk of that happening.
And then on the south side, the bulb out into Marin, I guess I'm wondering if that could be, I mean, it might have to be tapered, but be more aggressive in terms of extending out further. So I don't know what the lane widths on Marin, when it was reconfigured, I believe were 11 or 11 and a half feet. I don't know if you recall what they are now, but it isn't a truck route. So the lane potentially could get narrowed, and the bike lane doesn't have to be 6.5 feet wide along a bulb out. And so there might be some trade-off there in terms of timing and LOS, because if you bring the bulb out further, that brings down the, well, I don't know, what's controlling the length of the green phase on Masonic? Is it the motorists or the crossing time for people who activate the crossing on Marin?
For north and south traffic. Yeah, the throughput, the through movement, is generally controlled by the pedestrian clearance, and then you need the extra increment to try to clear out the queue for the left turns.
Right.
So
if you shorten that, if you shorten the, or if you make the bulb outs on the south side extend further, then that would shorten the signal time. I mean, because that's the controlling. So you'd shorten the time for clearing the Greenway, and so you'd be able to shorten that green phase and give the time over to the Marin side.
Yes.
So that might be something to, you see where I'm headed.
I do.
So we've sort of blended into comments. Are there comments? I think she's staff, right? Some sorts. You're touching the lights. I figure you're staff.
I'll just mention I did present the turning templates to the fire department. They do utilize Marin fairly commonly to avoid Solano until they get further east. Their primarily concern was in the right turns and not making the ideal turn every time and sort of impact on their tires, their vehicles. So the idea of something that was less damaging or mountable for them was, I think, their main concern, but we can look in more detail with when we get into design.
So staff is looking for direction or a selection of an alternative.
If I would look for feedback on the alternatives, the consultant's recommending one of them, as well as other elements we should consider. That now's the time before we go into detailed design. I'd like to get anything on the table now so that we know what we're dealing with in design.
Back to the commission.
So I think alternative 3, which is what you're recommending, makes sense. Yep. You're the professional, so easier for me to say. I think you see in terms of my concern, I'm more in favor to the extent it meets with your, professional opinion of making the bulb out on the north side, on the smaller side, and the bulb out on the south side, on the larger side. And as far as the bulb outs, how far they extend along Marin, this drawing just shows them at the Greenway path. And I think the ATP shows them extending the width of the whole width of the Greenway. And I think there'd be some utility in reclaiming that space. What it's used for, it could be landscaping, it could be low-impact development, or it could be green infrastructure. It could be green infrastructure ready. If the funding isn't there, it potentially could be built in a way, at which point, if there is funding, a retention basin could be put in the future. So I think this would be a good project to claim that space, because right now, unless somebody tells me otherwise, it doesn't seem like it's particularly occupied by parked vehicles, and at least in the eastbound direction, most often seems to be occupied by parked vehicles that are for sale. So it'd be an opportunity to take that space and maybe use it for something else. As far as the UPS transfer area, I'm sympathetic to that. I think urban space is valuable, and so I'm wondering if some discussion with UPS would be in order towards looking at another spot. I mean, they may really like that, because then they just go to Solano, turn right, and they're gone. But further up, the next block on Masonic, there's, as we've been talking about, there's a huge amount of unoccupied parking on the east side. So I think to the extent that, we can facilitate and help out in a discussion with them on other places that have under-occupied parking, that might be good.
I would bet the direction that they're facing is key, though, right?
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Left turns versus right turns.
Yeah, right. Let's see, what else? I think you brought up removing the cycling lanes on Masonic, and I think that's fine. I mean, they're short. I ride Masonic rather than the Greenway just because I prefer to be in the road. But I think based on the split that I mentioned, most people ride on the Greenway, and people who aren't comfortable riding in the road can ride on the Greenway. There's a facility there, so I don't see that as a big loss. And just want to congratulate you again on getting the grant, because I think there were only two or three grants in the East Bay or grant applications in the East Bay that succeeded in this funding cycle. So nicely done.
Great. Other comments? Are we all in agreement on alternative 3?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Staff have enough comments from the commission?
I think that's good. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to 5-2, discussion and possible motion on draft climate action and adoption plan strategies.
As Lizzie comes up, I'm just going to introduce her. Lizzie Craig is our Civic Spark Fellow, who is working with Claire Griffin on the preparation of our climate action and adaptation plan. And she'll make a presentation for you this evening and answer your questions.
Yes, but how do I get my presentation on that screen? Oh, there it is. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm Lizzie Carrad. I'm the Civic Spark Climate Fellow with the City of Albany. And we have been hard at work on our climate action and adaptation plan, which we're currently in the public comment period, which is why I'm here. So thank you for having me. But we want to get a sense specifically about what the Traffic and Safety Commission thinks of our transportation actions, which start on page 36, if you have the cap in front of you. But before we go to the actions, I'll give you a brief overview of our process and how we got to where we are now. So the City of Albany has ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals of 60% by 2035 and carbon neutrality by 2050. And we're defining carbon neutrality as our goal is to get to 0 greenhouse gas emissions within the city limits, but any emissions that we're unable to completely eliminate by 2050, we will balance out with carbon sequestration, both using natural methods and also any technology that becomes available in the future. I think it's exciting to note that after the city opted all residential, industrial, and commercial accounts into our East Bay Community Energy carbon-free electricity, we've already reached our 2020 goal, so we're really excited to move forward to our 2035 and 2050 goals. So why should we take climate action in the City of Albany? It's important to take climate action to mitigate the effects that Albany will feel due to climate change, as well as adapt, and also to show, to be a leader in climate action, both regionally and for the nation. So climate impacts that will be felt in Albany, which we just felt a couple weeks ago, increased events of extreme heat, increased rain events and flooding, some sea level rise around the shoreline, and also increased wildfire risk, and also smoke impacts from wildfires that may not be within our jurisdiction, but nearby or miles away. There are also many co-benefits that come from local action on climate change, including creating a more resilient community, both creating a community that's prepared for any disasters or those impacts that I just mentioned. We can also improve local air quality, urban beautification, providing more green spaces and spaces for people to enjoy the outdoors, and then also public health and safety. Like I mentioned, if we can mitigate the effects of wildfire and wildfire smoke, that'll have rippling health effects. So how did we get here? We started research on the new CAP back in August of 2018, and actually before that, our Climate Action Committee has been talking about this new CAP since early in 2017, before I even got here. In October of 2018, we opened a community survey where we wanted to gauge community interests and priorities for what they wanted to see in a climate action plan, and we also got a sense of how they wanted to be involved in the planning process. It was really exciting. We got over 300 responses to that survey, so it gave us a pretty good picture of where to start the planning process. Then November through December, we did internal staff interviews with our staff in Albany to determine what would be feasible and what directions we should go to make sure that if we're developing a plan, it can actually be implemented. And then in January, we held a community workshop, and we had over 65 people, we think, at one point come and give input about what different climate adaptation efforts they wanted to see in the plan, as well as unique solutions they had to mitigate climate change. And then in March, we had 4 stakeholder meetings with some business stakeholders, green infrastructure, transportation, and property owners. And that all led to our draft plan, which you have in front of you today. And we're currently in this public comment period bubble, and we'll be collecting public comments until July 19th. And our goal is to have the plan go to council in October. So what has resulted from this extensive community engagement process is our climate action plan that focuses on reducing emissions and adapting to climate change with 4 main objectives. The first one is electrification of new and existing buildings, trying to transition out natural gas and electrify so that we can take advantage of our carbon-free electricity that we already have. Transitioning to low-carbon transportation, both trying to electrify vehicles as well as promote active transportation and public transit. Our goal is to try and create or promote a more carbon-free economy so that people in our city understand that the choices they make with purchasing have emissions tied to them, as well as making sure that any kinds of purchases we're making as a city are low carbon decisions. And then accelerate resilience for all is that adaptation component. So right now, as I mentioned, we're in our public review process. We're going to be going to all the committees and commissions that can weigh in on the parts of the CAP. So you are the second. We went to Economic Development Committee last week, Traffic and Safety, Parks, Rec, and Open Space, Social and Economic Justice, and then our Climate Action Committee has been working on this plan with us throughout the entire process. So now I will take you to the CAP, and as I mentioned, we'll focus on transportation to start. If anyone has any general comments, we can save those to the end, or you're more than welcome to email them. This is my email address, ekarad@albanyca.org, and I'll be collecting the public comments to make sure that they're considered for the final version. Any questions before I pull up the CAP, though?
Anyone? Oh, go ahead.
as she's doing that, I'll just point out that we realize this is a draft. There are things that people look at it and, some editing things that we wanted to get it out to everybody, and just wanted to acknowledge that we know it's not perfect. We didn't want to wait any longer to get it out.
Yeah, I think the Monday, we released it on a Friday, and that Monday morning I came in and someone said, on the last page, you recommend that people drive alone more than once per week. That was not our goal. We wanted them to carpool more than once per week. But when you're reading it 50 times, it doesn't quite hit you on the last page. So yeah, any of those small comments, I encourage you to email them to me. But perfect. So as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing this transition to low carbon transportation, which is our transportation section. So our goals are, with the section, to decrease passenger vehicle miles traveled through use of alternative modes, as well as transition passenger vehicles to electric alternatives, and also support or promote active transportation. So we can either go one by one, or if anyone wants to call out actions that they've looked at that they'd like to make comment on.
There's few enough that we can go one by one? I don't know. Yeah. Okay with the group?
Okay. So we'll start with 2.1.1.
Actually, I had a question that's more overarching. What is the envisioned period over which this plan will be operable? So that the last climate action plan was adopted in 2012, and we're doing an update that'll be adopted in 2019 and seems likely to be adopted. So that's about 7 years. Is that the length of time over which this plan is envisioned to be operable?
As a general rule, across all sorts of different kinds of plans, anything after about 10 years is pretty stale generally. In a fast-changing area of policy, it might be less than that. So, like as you mentioned, our current climate action plan is 7 years old, but it's no longer a useful plan for the city moving forward. So, in this particular area, it may be a little bit less than that. But if you had to just kind of want a time frame, I would say 10 years or so.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Any comments on 2.1.1?
Oh.
I'll just say that the Alameda County Transportation Commission, in order for us to receive our pass-through funds from Measure BB, does require us to update the bike and pedestrian plans every 5 years. So I think if we're using our ATP to serve that purpose, keeping it updated every 5 years is something we're going to have to do anyway.
So right now, I think it's, actually, I'm sorry, I think I said the CAP was adopted in 2012. I think it was actually adopted in 2009. And I think the ATP was adopted in 2012.
Yeah, that's
Right. So we're beyond I'm not aware that they're hardcore
They're
about
not
that, but
pushing super hard, but yeah, it's just something we should
Sure,
kind of
okay.
keep in mind.
And I did go to the Climate Action Committee, so you've heard some of what I'm about to say before. If it is a plan that's envisioned to be operable for 10 years, then it would go beyond just developing a new active transportation plan. That would presumably happen in the next few years. Developing and adopting the plan in and of itself would not result in any greenhouse pollution reduction. So I suggest that the commission ask that instead of having this be the measure, that instead the measure be implements a motorist-separated cycling network throughout the city. That is what is actually shown worldwide to potentially make a substantial difference. Obviously, you need to do the plan as a part of that. And in a 10-year time frame, I don't suspect that that network would be fully built. So it might be that if the commission's in agreement that that would be the measure and maybe some percentage metric would be put on it. We had that approach in the Climate Action Plan. The Climate Action Plan actually had 2 stages of cycling network defined. One was sort of paint and sign, and it had specific percentage implementation targets by year for when that would be done, and that was called Stage 1, and then Stage 2 was a motorist-separated network, and I don't recall that that had any target set for it, but I think with the policy development through time that Director Bond just mentioned, there's more awareness that protected cycling facilities are what makes a difference, and we do have more of them now, so I think maybe now we're at a point where we could set a target for 10 years from now.
Other comments on 2.1.1? All right, next one.
2.1.2, research feasibility and emissions impact of implementing a parking management strategy to reduce VMT.
You know, I'll say this. I was going to, one of my comments is for the time frame, given that transportation emissions are the greatest percentage, can we move the time frame to near term for everything instead of midterm?
Except for maybe this one.
I mean, there might be some marginal benefit to this being in the midterm because with the change in zoning with regard to off-street parking requirements, I looked back at the last 3 or 4 years of Planning and Zoning Commission projects that they considered, and in the last, I think in the 3 months, I don't know, it was like November, December, and January, they considered, I can't remember, it was like twice as many new units as they had considered in the previous 3 years, which seemed to be, I mean, my hypothesis is that that's because we've reduced the parking requirements for off-street. So there haven't been, I don't recall seeing a lot of new units on their docket since then. So maybe that was just, you know, in the statistical noise. But my thought is if that actually does bend the curve, then there might be, you know, for Albany at least, for Albany, considerable housing development, you know, sometime 5 or 10 years out, in which case the parking situation could change pretty dramatically. And I think that the parking management plan that was adopted in 2017 found that even in the Solano and San Pablo corridor, which is one block off of each, that the parking occupancy was so low that parking management wasn't justified currently. That usually parking management kicks in when you're at, I don't know, what, like 85%, 90% occupancy, and we were way under that. So until a lot more housing is built and there's a lot more demand for parking, I mean, that might be a reason to keep it midterm.
I think we'd like to reserve the public comment to the end, and we'll go through commission questions through each one, and then we'll get to public comment, if that's okay.
Okay, I'm not objecting, but normally the commissions take public comment first, and questions.
And we're already commenting?
Commenting on each item.
Yeah, that is true.
I didn't really have a comment on this so much as a footnote, but that's all.
Actually, I think you're right. So I think in the past we have done this where we've, when we've commented on individual items, then we've had the public come up as well. So why don't you go ahead and come up if it's on a specific item there.
Really brief on this one. I came for it.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Ed Fields. This was going to be a footnote to my real comment, but I didn't realize that it was actually there. First of all, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but the parking requirement in Albany was only reduced for multifamily housing, which, is that correct?
That and accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, which never made sense to me because more dense units only require 1 parking space, but spread out units like single-family homes still require 2 parking spaces in Albany. Never made sense, but that was a political, you know, what do they call it, live wire. And so when you do an addition on your house, you still have to pay and request a parking exception if you don't have the second parking space. Anyway, but the footnote was at the workshop when I was in front of the transportation piece and I got my comment in, and it was to only have parking on one side of the street in Albany and then have a real bike lane on the other side of the street. And that comment was rejected. Whoever was standing there, and I'm not picking on anybody, don't go back and look at the video, they wouldn't even write it. So I just got up there with the marker and wrote it myself. So it shows you where we are.
Thank you. Anything else on parking management? Okay. On to a curb management program that prioritizes carbon reduction. My comment on this one is with regard to rideshare and the other strategies where you mentioned rideshare. Is that defined as like TNCs, Uber and Lyft?
Rideshare,
Yeah.
yes. We were also including TNCs.
Okay. So my general comment on rideshare is that I think it would be counterproductive to the goal of reducing VMTs. I think it's showing that it's increasing VMTs, at least in San Francisco. So we should be encouraging rideshare that's more than 2 people in a car. Maybe carpooling is probably the better definition term.
Okay. Thank you.
Other comments?
Is there any, for electric vehicle charging, is there any on public streets in Albany?
No.
No.
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we have discussed it. I don't know what those projects are. The ones, we didn't get the grants, right, for the library.
Yeah, no, we got a small grant. There was a problem with the contractor that was retained to install them, that we're going to have to sort that out. And while we're doing that, the potential changes are coming down. Potential change in regulations from the California Air Resources Board may make us kind of have to go through start a little bit earlier in the process again. I haven't looked at the details, but the newer chargers are going to have to be interoperable in the way that some of the current chargers aren't, if these regulations are adopted.
Okay. Onward, 2.1.4. Comments?
Great, as a car share user. Although, I question a little bit the need for car share to sit on Solano when you can park just 2 spots off it, but if it's possible, I'm not saying I would do it, but I might do it in the next city over where I would be headed, so.
Yeah, our goal with this one was so that if someone wants to take, if they don't own a car, to try to keep them from not having to buy a car, if they want to drive a gig car share to Solano and park it there and not have to worry about having to move it later. That was our goal with this one. We couldn't explicitly call out. So it seems we might have to change the wording a bit, but that's our goal with this action.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess as there's potentially more housing on Solano, then that could be more of an issue. The people who don't want to have a car and want to use a shared car could then park on Solano. It's certainly been useful for me. I have 1 car in the family, and my son has it in Oakland now, and it's all good because I have gigs. So.
Okay. Next one. Is it 2.1.5? Yeah, it looks good to me.
All right.
Comments? All right.
Well, I guess, that the recent history's been fairly laissez-faire, which I've agreed with in terms of, I wouldn't necessarily say the city's been working with providers or against providers, or been come on down if you want, and let's see what happens. So this seems to envision something more proactive than what has happened in the past. And is that, I'm just sort of curious from staff's perspective, what you think of that. I mean, given that not being proactive in the past seems to have worked out pretty well. Because I guess my concern is there's a lot of measures here. I mean, it's not quite as dense as the previous climate action plan, but there's still a lot of measures. And so when there's a measure in here, then, and it's adopted, and then there's going to be some expectation by council, I imagine, at some point that staff takes some action on them. So I almost prefer having fewer measures so that it really focuses staff's energy. And so I'm just bringing it up for discussion.
I think I agree that the laissez-faire approach thus far has worked for us, and the larger cities in the area are going to drive this one way or the other anyhow. So I'm not sure that there's anything we could do right today to expedite the use of these kinds of programs in Albany. Maybe in the future, but we don't. If an opportunity were to present itself in the future, I think we'd probably pursue it, even if it wasn't in this policy document, if it seemed to make sense for the community. So yes, if you wanted to recommend an action that might be eliminated, this could be one of those.
Yeah, or maybe it could have some contextualizing or some caveat, because it is something that's likely to happen and likely to help us, whether we focus on it or not. So maybe that could somehow be conveyed, that this may not be something that staff actually has to take action on, but we wanted to include it in the plan because it's likely to help us out.
With the note that when someone does roll out in larger scale, there probably will be a fair bit of staff work to make it go smoothly.
You mean a larger scale than what Lime did with its bikes, or is that, do you know something?
I'm just, as we've observed this in other communities, I think there is definitely hesitation within Albany on how this rolls out, and it'll involve, I think, some active working with the provider as they launch here or launch in neighboring jurisdictions, and we welcome them across the border as well to make it as good of a rollout as possible. So I think, yeah, we don't necessarily need to do a whole lot of work encouraging them to come. We are trying to maintain an open door, but we'll probably need to devote some resources to try to make it go as smoothly as possible, to not have to do a lot of regulation on it on top of that.
I personally don't feel like there's an excessive amount of action. I mean, I look at a lot of policy documents often, and this doesn't seem like an excessive amount of actions.
Good. All right. You work on EIRs, right? Which those things are like insane sometimes.
Other comments? 2.1.6?
All right.
So with this one, I guess what it's saying is to explore demand for an electric shuttle to BART stations and along Solano and San Pablo Avenues. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that AC Transit has bus service, frequent bus service on Solano and San Pablo and to BART stations that would be hard to replicate by any city, I think. So I think what needs to be stated here is filling in the gaps with maybe another service, or encouraging AC Transit to fill in those gaps. And I remember for the city of Albany, for a number of years, when the connection was broken between Pierce and Solano, that was a big one that I know the residents had complained about. So maybe there's some gaps there. I know serving Target is also a gap, and that's a major retail destination. So yeah, so maybe it's more about doing things that that AC Transit can't do, and also pushing AC Transit to put zero-emission vehicles out there, and to have the right connections with its service. I think one other thing we can put in here, I don't know if it's an additional item or additional strategy, is it seems like throughout the country that your biggest barrier to riding public transit, or one of the barriers, is whether or not you have to pay a fare. And so there's lots of cities throughout the world that are trying this now. I think countries are trying this now. Estonia, I believe it is, where they're trying to remove the fare barrier from riding public transit, so whether it's AC Transit or BART. And so I think that would be a big encouragement, and right now a barrier for people not to try transit is you have to pay for it. So some sort of strategy on encouraging free transit use would also be good.
But, I mean, I think for somebody on Solano to get to one of the BART stations now by AC is not straightforward. No knock on AC because of where AC is going, but you would have to take the 18 down to the 72.
Depends which way you're going, right? If you're going north, then yes, it is a challenge. But if you're going south, then you'd go to downtown Berkeley BART.
Right, but then you'd really be extending the time of your trip. I mean, if you were taking a bus to downtown Berkeley BART to take BART somewhere, rather than getting on BART in North Berkeley, or
it probably depends on where you're going,
right,
and how far that leg of the BART train is going to be. But if you're going to downtown Oakland, I mean, I do it daily.
you take the bus to downtown Berkeley.
I do. Or I'll walk, depending on the frequency. But I live on the 79, so it's a lower frequency route. So whatever the timing is, it works for me. But I think the connection isn't the worst.
Yeah, because I guess I envisioned a loop that would be down Solano and then straight over to the BART station and just looping.
Yeah. So like to Plaza or something, like down to Pearson up to Plaza or something like that.
I mean, it could actually go, right, exactly. Yeah.
And maybe that's a routing if there was enough analysis into that said, that's where the people want to go, right? That's where the cell phones are all tracking. That's the trip that they want. Then maybe that's a way that you can figure out if that's something that can be done with public transit.
I think the autonomous is on here because I brought this up in the workshop about the Bishop Ranch as the first autonomous vehicles in the world that are public transit that are operating on public streets. Something would be interesting to have this in there because that reduces the cost to within reach potentially. So I don't know if AC is thinking of moving into that world for, obviously not for your long haul, not for your long haul, but maybe, sort of shorter connections like this.
I think our position is probably following what the market does, but 30 years from now, if all public transit is autonomous, we wouldn't be surprised. But I think it's that short term of when that's going to happen.
Right. Yeah, I guess I wasn't necessarily. I've seen more of the Bishop Ranch model where, you might have, there's small shuttles that would loop on Solano and just, Solano and then maybe even over on Cornell and through the plaza and to BART and then back on Ashbury or something like that, which is maybe a sufficiently not chaotic enough or not so chaotic that an autonomous vehicle couldn't handle it as opposed to going on San Pablo or something like that. Right.
Yeah, there's certainly limitations with what I don't think it's an issue to put in a study of autonomous vehicles in this. The only thing now that the constraint is that the vehicle is fairly small, right? That Bishop Ranch one, I think, carries 8 maybe or somewhere around there. And so how much demand would you be able to generate in Albany? Would it exceed that or not?
The reason I brought up the autonomous vehicle is because this has been looked at perennially, and basically unless it's autonomous, I don't see any way Albany could finance something like the merry-go-round or anything like that. It's just so astronomically expensive with the labor.
Correct.
I think it's the kind of thing that really only makes sense if an operator comes in and offers to do it the same as Lime or any of the other shared mobility, where it's kind of a demand-based transit service. But again, that's only useful if it fits their economic model. Plus the questions of what restrictions there are about competing with AC Transit on fixed route.
Yeah, AC Transit would have like a right of first refusal or
Yeah.
something like that.
I mean, if it were more like, connecting neighborhoods to BART and maybe Solano on the way, that might be one thing, but that's not a fixed route. So if it's providing a different type of service, again, that's not something that the city would provide. We might encourage it if someone were to offer up a model that made sense, that was essentially user-funded. But
I think that's something that would be included in the strategy, is looking at demand response models, because they exist out there. They're kind of on the fringe of how good or bad they are, but or how successful or not successful they are. But that is something that's popular now, is basically larger Uber vehicles.
Yeah.
Right? And calling those up to your house, and being able to schedule a trip to the BART station at a specific time.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of new to the transportation world. So you're suggesting that we add something to this measure saying, look into a,
Yes, in this one, yeah. So I think my real comments, did you get my other ones about the fares and the filling in gaps? But for this, also, exploring demand response service. Well, I think that's also called microtransit.
Yeah.
And seeing if there's a market for that here, to meet the needs of the neighborhoods of Albany and connecting them.
Yeah, and I think, the city could defray part of the cost of that, which is based on the model of public transit. I mean, the rider doesn't pay the full fare typically. A measure that's not on here and is a reach, but maybe not as much of a reach as it's going to sound like when I first say it, which is implementing a tax on gasoline in Albany. So the usual response to that is, well, if you tax gasoline locally, then people just go to a different gas station. Well, there's economic studies that show there's actually pretty dramatic inelasticity in where people shop for gas. And if you can raise it some and people won't go to a different station because it's just not worth their time. Right now, the statutory authority doesn't exist, but it does exist for counties to levy a gasoline tax, which, to my knowledge, no county in the state has availed itself of. Ahead of RM3, so MTC polls on gasoline taxes across the 9-county area, again, perennially, and it always comes out a dog. But before RM3, the spring before RM3 was on the ballot, it actually came out thumbs up. And so they were debating internally if they should put a gasoline tax for the whole area on the ballot, and they decided, well, no, we've got this RM3 on the ballot. If we try to double dip, we might get nothing. So they backed off. It would take state action probably to extend that statutory authority to cities under counties, but nonetheless, it might be something to have on here just in case some opportunity comes along. And then that money could be specifically directed towards reducing Albany's emissions or pollution from transportation, such as defraying the cost of these on-demand services to get people to BART.
How many gas stations are 2?
I think there's 3, yeah. But the ones on Marin have a pretty large catchment because they seem to catch everybody that comes out of North Berkeley. Other than the one at the top of Solano, and I've always wondered if you can see the inelasticity of price because the one that's on the way to the freeway, which I always interpreted as it could charge 30 cents more because people are in a rush to get to work or something. That's the only hypothesis I could come up with. Like, how can this possibly exist?
Maybe to move things along, we can go by the approach, and there's like 2 per approach or something. So the next one is the encourage density through infill development. Oh, yes, please, come on.
Ed Fields again. With the goal of reducing VMT, we are using the Climate Action Adaptation Plan to get an increase in building heights in Albany. We have already seen that it is possible to build out to approved densities under the existing regulations, especially since parking requirements have been reduced. So I have a few thoughts on what I call the bigger picture. First, it has been shown that VMT is reduced more by locating jobs rather than housing near transit. Secondly, if we add another 1,000 residents to Albany, communities like Antioch and Brentwood, where I was recently, will still add more housing for another 50,000 residents, because they just have. And the third point that I want to make, which I think is the main point and maybe the biggest picture, first of all, I have to say no disrespect to Jeff or any other planners in the room. At the beginning of the 20th century, we built apartments in the inner cities to house workers. In the middle of the 20th century, we ripped up the tracks for mass transit, and urban planners brought us the auto-dependent suburbs. Now that the planet is threatened by climate destruction brought on by industrialization and fossil fuel-based transportation, and agriculture, I might add, they're telling us that was all wrong, and we need to house workers in the inner cities again. So I have some quotes here. Quote, mass urbanization has been made possible by the prodigious exploitation of fossil fuels. As of 2018, the world has over 1,000 urban areas, which may include multiple city jurisdictions, with over 500,000 people at an average density of 11,000 people per square mile, or 17 people per acre, unquote. I might note exactly the population density of Albany. Quote, 37 urban areas have over 10 million inhabitants. The circulatory system of a modern city is very active, and it requires high energy inputs to keep the city dwellers fed and prevent the buildup of wastes. And I know another way to say that, which I won't. Another quote, contrary to the forecasts of most demographers, urbanization will reverse course as globalization unwinds during the 21st century. The eventual decline in fossil hydrocarbon flows and the inability of renewables to fully substitute will create a deficiency of energy to power bloated urban agglomerations and require a shift of human populations back to the countryside. In short, the future is rural, which is the title of the report by Jason Bradford of the Post-Carbon Institute, from which these quotes are taken. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, other comments? Development?
I guess just to that, Mr. Field's comment, it reminds me of the predictions at peak oil, which have turned out to be radically incorrect. So the world is a chaotic system in a mathematical sense, and so I question anybody's ability to actually predict anything that far out.
Take that as you may.
Any more comments on this approach?
I think I've heard Jeff say outside of this forum that because of state action, it's fairly, pretty much any developer can build almost any density or height within reason that they would want to within Albany's higher density zones, regardless of our zoning, due to the density bonuses and other things that are available. Is that an accurate portrayal, or is that inaccurate?
I wouldn't say it's a blank slate. The density bonus regulations do provide the opportunity for exceptions to zoning ordinances, but as the density bonus works today, there needs to be affordable housing elements to that project. And so it's not just any developer walking in, it's somebody who's got an element of affordable housing, one exception being if it's a senior housing project. So here in Albany, the one density bonus project we've completed so far is Belmont Village. But there certainly have been some very dramatic pieces of legislation introduced in the state legislature over the past few years. And my sense is that Whether or not they pass this year is some question, but they're not going away, and there will be requirements for cities to waive some of the zoning regulations that keep projects, as the practical matter, keep projects below the overall allowed density in a city. So for example, here in Albany, our zoning districts, San Pablo as an example, the allowed density is 63 units an acre. Strictly following all the regulations in the zoning ordinance, you're lucky if you got 30 units an acre. And so those different things, that whether it's parking or open space or setbacks and so forth, those are going to be chipped away by state law. So I agree with you to some point, but not completely erasing the local zoning, at least so far. But at least one member of the state legislature probably would want to do that.
Yeah, so I guess that's the sort of inherent contradiction that I'm always struck by, is that our R3 areas have 63 units per acre allowed, but I think the maximum building height without bonuses is 38 feet.
You're correct.
Which is like, completely contradictory. So I would have some interest in increasing that building height limit so as not to require developers to jump through a bunch of hoops. Either that or reduce the density in our zoning, at least make it internally consistent. Don't, because right now it's kind of a misdirect, and I don't really like having that statement out there as a city saying, oh yeah, we allow 63 units per acre, but by the way, not really. I think we should tell it like it is, unless the planning tells me there is some utility in having it 63 units per acre, even though it is a 38-foot height limit.
I agree with the sentiment that our zoning ordinance should be internally consistent, but I also need to respect the work that went into the zoning ordinance that we have, and it evolved in response to what the community has said over the years. So sometimes there's some internal inconsistencies in what our community wants, and that zoning ordinance reflects that. So we work with what we've got. But we will be looking at this. I don't want to spend a lot of, unless you really want to, I don't know that you need to spend a lot of time on this particular action item, but there is a grant from the state that we're pursuing that would allow us some funding to look at our zoning ordinance to better facilitate housing development, higher density housing development in our mixed use areas. And we'll be working on that in the next year or so.
So what about the other R3 areas? So there's other R3 areas in the city that are not really in the mixed use or commercial corridors.
Those could also be candidates. We're a little bit more interested in the transit corridors. And R3 tends to be perhaps politically a little bit more challenging, probably would be politically more challenging. But there's no, we'll take whatever direction we get and take on whatever area the city people are willing to take on. But the San Pablo Avenue is the obvious first place to start. There are parcels that are owned there by people who've purchased them to make real estate investments, and they want to be able to do that over the next few years to provide housing that would serve the community. I think we need to help figure out a way to make that happen. So that's our priority at this point is San Pablo.
I mean, I guess I think of the R3 down by Pierce because there's a Transbay bus line there. So, I mean, I've heard that's from people who live along Pierce. That's one of the advantages and reasons that they like living there, is because they've got an alternate way to get to the city in rapid order. So I wouldn't necessarily discount R3 areas like that as, I mean, in some ways that might be more meaningful transit even than San Pablo has, in a sense.
And as your public comment received this evening, the public commenter mentioned, we are working on a project in what's about to be a new R3 portion of that area for the 60 units of the Saha project. So that's really the best or there are two potentially developable sites in that area of city, that city-owned parcel that we're working on, and then there's an 11-acre parcel on the west side of Albany Hill that's privately owned, that's zoned for residential development. That's not an R3. It has a residential hillside designation of its own, and it has some density limits that have been set by the voters that are embedded in our zoning ordinance. So that particular parcel would have to go through a different process.
Please, quickly.
There is something to be said.
You can come up. Thank you.
Really quick. Thank you. There is something to be said for maintaining the incentive for affordable housing, because we've seen that every time that we, increase some ability to provide housing and don't attach affordable housing to it, then we don't get the affordable housing. And the density bonus does do that. And I think the other thing is that, if I recall, there was a project proposed for San Pablo Avenue that actually did meet the allowed density and almost bumped up against it. It was surprising. The one for those parcels that go through to Canes, near Sam's Log Cabin, that parcel with the little driveway. And somehow they managed to, they maybe needed to get rid of one parking space or something, but I think they did reach 63 units per acre. It was 10,000 square feet. But anyway, thank you.
Well, doesn't Albany have an affordable percentage requirement and it was overturned by some case and now it's back again because of state legislative action?
You're correct. We have an inclusionary housing requirement. So anybody who builds more than 7 units of housing has to provide 15% of the units need to be affordable.
And under density bonus, if they want to go above height, do they then, I guess then it's a negotiation with the city, or is there some state guidance on what the affordable or what the inclusionary housing percentage has to be in that case?
It's a very complicated piece of legislation, and there is some, it's not, there are percentages and formulas embedded into it, but there's also a policy decision in evaluation and acceptance of the application, so it's a little bit of both.
Well, I think I've taken us far enough away from traffic and safety. Thank you for your forbearance. Although it does appear in the transportation section, so.
All right, are we ready for the next approach?
Yeah, I think we can just take goal number 2 as a whole, if there's comments in that section.
Sorry?
You mean the approach?
Yeah, I guess I was just one approach under goal number 2. Yeah, approach is increase access to electric vehicle charging infrastructure.
Yes. Yeah, that's the next approach. Perfect.
So for an electric vehicle action plan, has there been any discussion about, as city fleet ages out, replacing those vehicles with electric? And I realize there aren't electric fire trucks or things like that, but other vehicles, has there been a discussion about that, or could that be included in this, that as vehicles are retired, replacing them with electric vehicles?
So we actually do. I worked on this year a policy, clean fleet and motorized equipment procurement policy. And the goal is to reduce municipal fleet emissions as well as emissions from handheld equipment like leaf blowers and lawnmowers. And we're in the process of finalizing that, but the goal of that policy is to have, if a vehicle is going to get replaced, you have to do an analysis of can you switch it out for electric vehicle? If you can't switch it out for electric, can you at least maybe downsize or look at a different, a better fuel standard, or blanking on the term, but a more efficient vehicle.
Is that referenced in this? You may want to add a reference to that policy somewhere in the document. Yeah.
Okay.
Preston?
Yeah, this is kind of a overarching comment on this. In the memo, there's the 4 main objectives of the plan are, and I know those are upfront in the plan as well, but I really like this 4 bold, short statements. And so the first one's electrify our buildings, so that tells people exactly what's going on. I find transition to low carbon transportation is kind of more oblique or abstract for people. So I think making that statement as equivalently specific as electrifier buildings in some fashion, so transition to, I don't know what it would be, like biking, walking, and electric vehicles or something like that. So people can really access what it is that we're after.
Great.
Maybe it's encourage people to not drive by themselves. And if they do, it's in an electric vehicle or with some other people in the car.
So a really long title. Okay, thank you.
Overall, for the electric vehicles, same comment as I had earlier, that it still encourages increased VMT, which is opposed to one of the goals stated in the plan. So maybe it's couched with encourage electric vehicle with shared usage or shared, what would it be? Shared electric vehicles?
Mm-hmm. Apologize, I'm so quiet. I'm writing your notes.
I would like to touch on the resiliency, because there's a nexus in some of the resiliency with transportation. So specifically, the first approach, increase urban tree canopy coverage. So that's been shown by research. I first ran across this in a doctorate level research from a transportation engineer at UC Berkeley. And it's been found in other studies now that the presence of street trees results in more people using the sidewalk. And so there's a strong research-based nexus between those two, and I think that should be recognized. So obviously street trees can lower temperatures in the city, which makes the city more resilient in terms of people just being in the buildings, but it also has this transportation benefit as well. And in that regard, one of the items that this commission has discussed is structural encroachments onto city property, otherwise known as right-of-ways, and that there's a nexus between allowing those and reducing space for street trees. So right now, the city sidewalks on most streets are not out at the limit of the city property, which means that the space for street trees is constrained more than it needs to be. And so over time, there could be a policy to move those sidewalks over time as they're repaired, or at least move them in a manner that makes more space for where the tree wells are, which is occurring already for some of the repairs. But if you go around the town and look at where the repairs are, when there is a fence or any other obstacle that's been encroached onto the public property, rather than keeping the sidewalk width the same and just curving it around the tree, they're providing more space for the tree and they're narrowing the sidewalk. And given that this is city property, that's kind of a false choice that's having to be made. So I think there could be some policy thinking around, what to do with that property. And on the other hand, I know there's some streets where like a lot of the streets in Albany between Masonic and San Pablo have the same width of landscape strip. And there's not very many streets where there's, very big trees or much in the way of tree shading in those blocks. And yet there are streets that have the same width of landscape strip that I originally thought the strip was much wider because of the tree canopy cover. So Spokane between Brighton and Portland on the eastern side at the north end is just like 100% tree canopy cover. And until I really looked at it, I always thought, oh, well, that's because the landscape strip is much wider, but it's actually the exact same width. So the effectiveness of different species of trees varies dramatically. The same is true with the west side of Masonic, south of Marin. Again, it's like 100% tree canopy cover and a very narrow landscape strip. So there's multiple ways to get at it, but I think there should be some recognition between the availability of city property, the trees, transportation choices.
I could see introducing that in when we do a street tree master plan would be the place to to start talking about that.
I think if we have some policy guidance in this document about that or some statement, it would help lead into that, kind of in the same way that the Climate Action Plan had statements about active transportation infrastructure, and that led into the active transportation plan, fleshing that out more. So I think it was Ian McLeod, who's on the planning and zoning commissioner, said, this could really be the framework document for a lot of these other more specific plans that come along.
Okay. Other comments?
Great.
Anything else?
No, as I mentioned, if you have other, oh, sorry.
I was going to just say, and this is a minor edit, on page 13, there's a table that has footnote numbers but no text.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you have any other small comments like that, feel free to, no, thank you. Feel free to email them. I have, well, you'll probably have access to my email. But yeah, feel free. The public comment period is open until July 19th. I'll also be presenting at other committee and commission meetings, or if it's easier, just feel free to email or call me to provide additional comments. But thank you so much for walking through the Climate Action Plan with me today.
Can I ask what your process will be after you receive comments?
Yes, so after we get all the comments, we're going to incorporate them, go through all the different comments we have, synthesize them, incorporate them into the final plan, and then we'll also be working on an implementation plan, and then the plan should go to council in October. Did I miss anything big?
There will probably be a study session with the city council in September. Not sure exactly the date, but so they have a chance to review this like you are this evening.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Good work. Okay. I-3, Lower Codornices Creek Restoration Project, Phase 4, 8th Street to 10th Street.
Thank you. This is, before you is the 90% plans. You've seen these several times before at earlier stages. Primary changes from the plans you reviewed previously in December 2018 and again in March are the sidewalk width on the east side of 8th Street is widened to 12 feet and the street width is reduced to 22 feet. All stormwater from 8th Street now is passing through bioretention cell prior to entering Codornices Creek. There are softer radii for the bikes and a curb cut level exit on the north end of the sidewalk at 8th Street. 2 feet clear between seating logs and the trail on the eastern end towards 10th, and additional bike racks out of the path of travel near the bleachers. This was presented to Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Commission on June 13th. Their main comments was related to safety concerns regarding the mixing between bikes and peds and how we were going to sign that. So we are reviewing and preparing comments, but wanted to present this to you as well and solicit any additional questions or comments from the commission.
Okay. Questions from the commission? Yeah, we can jump right to comments. Comments?
Let's see. So on this drawing, first of all, thanks for all the changes. Good to see. On this drawing, the ramp to the north, well, first of all, we have a comment from that was put in by writing to have a ramp directly in line with the path rather than the way it is now, north and south. I just want to recognize that comment was made, and I don't think I'm particularly in favor of that. I think it's better for people, even though they will be on the sidewalk, people who are riding the path in theory are people who should be riding the path, who are people not like me, who are going 10 miles an hour or less. And so I think it's reasonable for them to be on the sidewalk and to enter in the place where, there's more safety, which is where the crosswalk is. But as far as the ramp to the north, I think it is a little awkward. And the curb, there's a retaining curb there on the north side, and it doesn't follow Albany standards, so it comes to a corner rather than having a radius. So Albany standard is a 2-foot radius on retaining curbs. So I think if that curb gets radiused at least 2 feet and maybe more, then somebody who's riding, because if you imagine you're riding straight north on that sidewalk, the aspect angle of that ramp is pretty narrow. So even though it may be 4 feet wide, following ADA standards, its purpose is really for people who are cycling north, and for that, it's extremely narrow in the direction they're going. So if you radius that curb, it'll open up the aspect a bit. The crossing to the south has truncated dome mats as required. The mat on the east side, people will be making a turning movement as they cross it. That's a particular hazard for those mats for people who are riding a bike. So I would ask that those mats be specified to be a high friction product. I can give you a name of some products. There's a product used in downtown San Diego that has much higher friction than what's used around here to try to help people not crash the way they have been on some of the other mats that have been put down on bike paths in the area.
It's like a coating that goes on top of it?
I think what they had in San Diego is a coating. I think there's both products. There's both coatings and integral. So yeah, I can try to look into that more. But I don't know on these plans how something like that would be specified. I don't know if you would specify a specific product or how you would go about specifying something like that.
There are product specifications that address that, then please provide that, and
Okay.
we can see how they would be.
Okay. The way the asphalt path junctions with the sidewalk now, it's a much softer radius on the inside of the turn, which is great. Thank you again for doing that. The path has kind of this double bend to it slightly now. And I think if it could just be straightened out between the two main curves, that would be better for flow. In other words, if you're headed westbound, you curve around to the left, and then if you're going to stay in your lane, presuming there's a center stripe on this thing, then you kind of curve around to the right again and then back to the left again. I mean, it's subtle, but if it can be eliminated, I think that would be good. And I think I have comments on other drawings. Oh yeah, I just want to recognize the solution on the south side of the speed table, or of that raised crossing, to have all the drainage go into a rain basin there and then go into a storm drain. I think it was a great solution to get rid of having to clean out those covered gutters on either side, which doesn't tend to work out that well. So going further east, there's a specification along the Portland cement portion of the path that what's adjacent to it is aggregate paving. What is aggregate paving? I mean, I have my own imaginings of what that is, but if you could explain it to me.
We have a different spec sheet that are specifications that goes into more detail that I can, if you want to look through that piece of it.
Okay, well, is it,
Separate from
because I mean, I usually think of aggregate like an AB aggregate, which is really coarse. I presume that's not what's envisioned, but I don't know. And is it a pavement? Is it a pavement with binder, or is it a unbound pavement, unbound granular material, or?
I haven't looked at that.
Okay.
So
all right. Well, so I'm just raising it as a question. What is that stuff? Is it a permeable pavement? Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's decomposed granite or what it is. If it is decomposed granite, just from my own experience of it, I would suggest using something else, because decomposed granite seems to support weed growth much more than other products with a similar textural distribution. For whatever reason, I could hypothesize, but I think there's other products that don't support weed growth. as much. The person who sent a written comment, Ian McLeod, was asking that to the extent possible, the rockeries be pulled away from the path a foot or so, and basically everything be pulled away from the path where it can be a foot or so to provide the opportunity for a softer running surface. So I don't know to the extent that's possible or not. I mean, there's a lot of places like in the transition from the Portland cement to the asphalt cement portion of the path on the inside of the turn, there's 3, I don't know, boulders, I guess you could call them. And so if those could get pulled back a foot, there's a tree there, though, that they're protecting, so I don't know if they can. So I would just look at that. And in particular, if you go to the next sheet to the east, the fence, so there's an area where the fence has to be right on the path because it's top of bank, essentially, it looks like. But as you go further east, there's a pretty reasonably sized area, flat area above top of bank where the fence is still right along the path. And then you've got the chain link fence of the field on the other side. So the path is really choked between a split rail fence and a chain link fence. And unless you tell me otherwise, it seems like the split rail fence could be moved back and even kept somewhat on line with where the split rail fence is, where the cement seating areas are. So you really open it up more, give it more of an open feel rather than a tunnel that people are going through there. And then that would also address providing a running surface. Sorry, if you go back to the previous drawing, I guess it is. So I think I saw there was a bike rack called out in the aggregate pavement area with the logs lining it to the south. And that seemed kind of a odd placement to me. It was perpendicular to the path. I couldn't quite tell if it was so close to the path that if somebody parked a bike there, their bike would potentially be crossing onto the path. I kind of wondered if it would be better to put bike parking, if it exists, to have racks, and I meant to go look at this, but I didn't get a chance, to have racks that are parallel to the back wall of the dugouts, outside of the dugouts, so people could, Little League players could pull up, park their bike, and go into the dugout. I don't know if the backside of the dugouts is open all the way across for people to go in and out, or if there's a particular entry-exit point. If there is a particular entry-exit point, then you could put bike parking behind both dugouts without, and having it oriented in a way so that people who park there don't, their bikes aren't going to interfere with the path. I also want to recognize that Ian brought up that it should be an asphalt cement path all the way through to emphasize that it's a transportation corridor. I understand why that isn't the case, and I do support that the purpose of the Portland cement is to really visually signal to people who are riding through that, this is a pedestrian priority area for the fields, and I think that's appropriate. Yeah, I think that's what I have. I'm going to read through more of Ian's message, but that's what I have queued up.
He also asked about lighting, I think. There's no lighting, right, as part of this project?
Not as part of the project. It's come up in discussion, but it's not part of the project at this point. Just a couple of comments back. I can look at a couple of the things. I think in terms of adjacent to the path, this is balancing the vegetation and the other interests. And I think to some extent we're at the point, if we want to pull things further from the path, it's probably narrowing the path, which I don't think we want to do. I think we're hesitant at this point to pull things further back. There's been balancing other stakeholders and the vegetation that's of interest where a lot of the rockery is. So I think we've heard those comments before. We've looked and we've made some adjustments, but unless there's particular areas to look at, I think we are talking about, if we are talking about pulling some of these other things away, we're talking about more removal of trees. Similar, I think, the design with the two curves is to avoid some of the larger existing trees that they're trying to avoid. So again, we can look at it again, but I think they're trying to thread and minimize the impact of the path to some extent. On the vegetation, so I did also look at the fence line on the one issue that I see, but I haven't discussed this with the consultants, is there is some vegetation proposed for that area. So the idea of putting the fence behind, you are creating sort of a different, like if you move the fence line back, you're impacting what kind of vegetation buffer that's gonna be there. Maybe that's still something that's desired, but partly it's all these things aren't shown on the same sheet, so there is a component of what that means for the planting plan. I was also going to mention, just because I have talked with the consultants a little bit about the ramp, and they were trying to balance the design for ADA compliance and pointing to, at least across the street where there is a curb cut that someone could cross. I think the guidance that I'm interested if there are other things we should consider or other things you would point out, but this isn't a pedestrian facility at this crossing. This would be more like a driveway exit. I discussed this to some extent with a colleague in Berkeley. The pedestrian should be crossing at the raised crosswalk and proceeding north on the west side of the street. So the idea of trying to make this an ADA compliant ramp when it's being put in to be for the bike facility, and it's going to serve that and the current design. So how, if we design it more like a driveway, it isn't the usual configuration of a driveway. So if someone is visually impaired, how do we make sure that it still feels like a driveway, that they shouldn't be going down that direction, or make it consistent with ADA considerations, but a design that would function with the reason that it's in there. So I think there is some work still to be done on that piece.
So yeah, I think I understand. I mean, in terms of the recurve of this section, if you go back to the drawing with the existing trees, it seems like so there isn't really an existing tree that's driving that double bend. I mean,
You're not saying bring the curve further north, you're talking bringing it further down then? Is that what you're saying?
Whatever, just straighten it out. Whether you bring the east end down to the south a bit or the middle up to the north a bit, whichever way. I mean, it seems like the middle could go to the north because there's no tree inside the radius of that subtle curve. But, again, there's multiple ways to do it. You could do a little of both. As far as the fence to the east end, I think it's a different issue than the rockeries, because the rockeries slope back from the path and they're basically below handlebar height, whereas the split rail fence could be at handlebar height. And so by having it hard up against the path there, you're effectively narrowing the path or risking people catching their handlebars, which they won't. They'll effectively narrow the path. So from the planning diagram, it looked like even if you can pull it back a foot, you would effectively make the path a foot wider, the paved part of the path a foot wider, and it seems like it would still work with the plantings. And the plantings might even grow through the fence in all likelihood, given what they've got scheduled there, which would be fine, and just create the shy distance that you're looking for. So I'd encourage you to look at that. Ian also did say, he said something about, I think, removing the concrete benches, which I presume are these. He said they're a tripping hazard. I don't really know why they'd be a tripping hazard because they're not in the travel line. So unfortunately, he's not here to say more about that. Thanks.
So staff is looking for are there other comments on this? Staff is looking for recommendation?
Comments.
Oh, don't you need some kind of approval from the commission to bring this to council?
That's right. We were looking for recommendation. Yeah.
Did you understand Ian's point number 6 on sheet L-23? This is about where the bollards are located. I didn't take the time yet to go through.
Yeah, so
where are the bollards?
The bollards are
Ones that prevent the cars from going through?
Are between the bike racks on this and the sort of shaded area here. So they are close to where the path enters 10th Street here. This is
And those are the ones he's
the line
talking about.
here. Yeah.
He says the existing concrete bollard should be moved further south on 10th. So is he talking about existing or is he talking about planned?
So this is showing where they're existing, and the plan just left them
Oh, I
in
see,
the
okay.
existing location.
Okay.
So he's saying that they should move further
Okay.
south.
I don't know, it seems like they're on the outside of the turn. So, I don't know. Does anybody else have a thought?
His concern was with turns in and out from someone
Oh,
going
okay.
north on 10th versus from the,
Oh, I see. So if you're coming up 10th and you want to turn west on the path. Probably not a lot of people making that movement, though.
Yeah.
I mean, if they're coming up that way, yeah. I mean, obviously, people living on that block might do that, but less clear who would be doing that from further away.
Yeah.
So with those suggestions, I'll recommend sending the engineering drawings to council for approval.
I'll second that.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None. Recommendation goes through. Okay, item 5-4 is City of Albany vehicle collision data.
You have arrived.
Main event, here we go.
So I'm Gracielita Diaz, and I did some research on collisions in the city of Albany and other small jurisdictions that have similar size population as well as a square mileage, and this data goes through the last 5 years. So this is the presentation agenda. I'm going to be walking you through my data collection and sources used, as well as some information from the active transportation plan that might be relevant to where these collisions are occurring. I'm also going to dive into specific collision data regarding pedestrian and bicyclist collisions. And the presentation focuses on severe and fatal injuries, but the spreadsheet you received with the staff report has more information on injuries from complaint of pain, visible to severe and fatal. Additionally, I will look at bicyclist and pedestrian collisions in other similar jurisdictions and in Alameda County. So for my data sources, I use the UC Berkeley TIMS database, and again, like I said, this goes through the past 5 years from 2013 to 2018, and the data from 2016 to 2018 are provisional. This is only including bicyclist and pedestrian collisions and does not include any highway data. So the active transportation plan was last reviewed in April of 2012, and this combined the city's previous bike and pedestrian plans into one. And the ATP focused on priority projects for bikes, bicyclists, and pedestrian improvements. And this lists the most recent improvements, and you can see many of these have been off major corridors such as Buchanan, Marin, and San Pablo. So there was additional bikeway and bike lanes on Buchanan, safe route to school improvements on Marin, and an activated pedestrian beacon at the intersection at Monroe and San Pablo. So this slide here discusses the fatal traffic accidents where there was pedestrians involved. As you can see, they were both along freeway ramps or on freeways. So even though this isn't necessarily under the city's jurisdiction, there was a pedestrian involved, and I thought it was important to include it in this presentation. The accident 2016 was a multi-vehicle crash due to a pedestrian violation being on the freeway, while the 2017 accident was due to a DUI, and the person killed was a passenger in a vehicle and not a pedestrian. This outlines the severe injuries in the past 5 years in the city of Albany for bicyclists and pedestrians. There's a total of 9 severe injuries, with 1 each year up until 2018. The accidents between, the accidents between 2013 through 2016 involved a vehicle being at fault, while the accident 2017, the pedestrian was at fault. In 2018, 3 out of the 4 were due to a vehicle being at fault, and the 4th one wasn't stated. And as you can see here, a lot of these accidents occurred off of major corridors and not necessarily residential city streets. I also thought it was important to highlight vehicle severe injuries throughout this time period. So even though these did not include bicyclists or pedestrians, these were additional accidents within city limits. So there were a total of 7 severe injuries and 1 fatal injury on residential streets. The fatal accident occurred in 2015 on Solano and Curtis, where a driver hit 2 parked vehicles due to unsafe starting or backing, and that driver was killed in the accident. Okay, so the next few slides kind of focused on a year-by-year information of bicyclist and pedestrian collision characteristics. So it talks about how many collisions occurred. So for 2013, there was 13 total collisions, 2 collisions at Solano Masonic, resulting in 1 visible injury and 1 complaint of pain. 7 collisions total were visible injuries, 5 were complaint of pain, and 1 was severe. Excuse me. Yes, so I just want to point out that a majority of these collisions were due to vehicle error, or the driver was at fault. For 2014, there was a total of 20 collisions with a few repeat collisions at San Pablo and Brighton, as well as Solano and Jackson. And in this year as well, mostly these accidents were caused by vehicles. In 2015, there was a total of 14 collisions with repeat collisions at the intersection of Solano-Cornell and the intersection of San Pablo-Garfield. In this scenario as well, most of them were caused due to vehicle being at fault. 2016, this one differs a bit because even though there was still a large number of total collisions, 18, there were seven of these collisions were vehicle at fault, while 5 were bicyclists at fault, and it was split pedestrians 3 and not listed 3. So this shows a little bit of a difference on what was going on during this year. In 2017, there was a total of 21 collisions, and there was no repeat collisions at certain intersections, but the trend continues where vehicles were mainly at fault. Lastly, 2018, there were 16 total collisions with a repeat collision at San Pablo and Brighton, and in this case, it's also a bit varied, where there were 7 accidents where the vehicle was at fault, 4 due to bicycles being at fault, and 2 due to pedestrians being at fault. Another thing I wanted to highlight in this presentation was the locations of where these occurred. And as you can see, whether on the handout you have or on the PowerPoint up here, a majority of the accidents were off of major corridors and not necessarily residential streets. So in 2013, only 2 were on residential streets, while the rest were on Solano, Buchanan, and Marin. The other years as well continues a similar pattern, only 4, 2, 3, and 7 and 3 were on residential streets. 2017 was the only year that saw an increase on accidents on residential streets, but a majority were off of the major corridors where there is more traffic with vehicles, bicyclists, and pedestrians. This quick chart just outlines how many pedestrian-involved collisions there were each year, with 2014 and 2017 having the most pedestrian-involved collisions. For bicyclist-involved collisions, the highest numbers were in 2013, 2016, and 2018. This chart here highlights the fatal and severe injuries in the city of Albany for the last 5 years, and the total number represented up there highlights all accidents. So this includes visible, complaint of pain, severe, and fatal, but the other 2 bars just indicate either severe or fatal accidents. And as I mentioned, there was only 2 fatal accidents in the city of Albany, but those were the ones near the freeway ramps, and then the rest, and there was only 9 severe injuries, while the rest were complaint of pain or visible injuries. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about similar jurisdictions, and I highlighted here which jurisdictions I'm going to focus on, which are Emeryville, El Cerrito, and Corte Madera, as well as Alameda County as a whole. And it shows you the similar size square mileage of the cities and populations. as well as Alameda's total square mileage and population. So Emeryville was very similar to the city of Albany in terms of severe and fatal injuries. They only had 2 fatal injuries in the past 5 years, and they did not have as many severe injuries. In terms of total, in terms of total collisions, their numbers were about the same as the city of Albany too, so that wasn't too much of a difference there. El Cerrito differs where they did not have any fatalities in the past 5 years, but they did have an increase in severe injuries. Puerto Madera also only had 1 fatal accident and a few severe accidents, so these numbers were also very similar to Albany and Emeryville. Here you see the total number of collisions in Alameda County, and this includes fatalities and severe injuries, and the total number is includes all fatal, severe, visible, and complaint of pain. So I just want to remind you all that this is just accidents on city streets. This does not include any highway data. And you could see that by these numbers, Albany and Emeryville play very little or very small percentage of total accidents throughout the county. So through my research, I realized Alameda County as a whole is a very large jurisdiction, and you could see that, like I just mentioned, Albany plays a small role in their total number of collisions, and a majority of collisions within city limits are among the busy corridors of San Pablo, Marin, Solano, and Buchanan. Additionally, the recurring collisions that occurred within city limits were on the major corridors and not on residential streets. So it was more common for these accidents to happen where there was more vehicles passing through, specifically San Pablo and Solano. Here, I kind of just break down for you the recurring collisions and the intersections they occurred at. Like I mentioned, San Pablo had the most, and I do think this is due to the fact that it is an alternate route for I-80 when it's congested, so we do see more through traffic and possibilities for vehicles to violate stoplights and possibly hit pedestrians or bicyclists. Like I mentioned, Albany's severe injuries were pretty average compared to the cities of Emeryville, El Cerrito, and Puerto Madera. While Albany had 9 severe injuries throughout the past 5 years, Emeryville had 5, El Cerrito had 19, and Puerto Madera had 11. And as I mentioned as well, El Cerrito was the only city that did not have any fatal accidents, but Albany's fatal accidents weren't more or less than other cities. So lastly, for my recommendations, I do think it's important to continue street safety improvements among the major corridors in the city, specifically at these intersections, because this is where there have been many repeat accidents throughout the years. And I think if we provided more treatments along these intersections, it would provide more safety to pedestrians and to bicyclists who are going through these corridors.
Thank you. That was a good collection of data and analysis. Really appreciate it. Questions or comments from the commission?
So the Tim's works off Switters, I think. And so I'm guessing not all the 2018 data is in because there was the fatality at Jackson and Solano.
Yes, it's 2016 through 2018 is provisional, so it's still
Okay.
being updated.
Okay. Because I thought there was, and maybe I don't recall, but I thought there was a fatality actually on San Pablo right here. That was like 3 years ago or 4 years ago.
There was one, I'm not sure if it was that recent, but it was at Buchanan, it's right in front of the police station, right at Buchanan in San Pablo. It was a pedestrian versus an auto.
Do you think it was before 2013?
It might have been.
Huh, okay.
These databases are not perfect.
Yeah.
Jackson Solano was this year, so that's not an.
Right. No, I'm talking about a different one. Yeah. I'm talking about the one that Jeff's remembering.
Your first comment was.
My first comment
Jackson
was
and
about
Solano.
Jackson Solano.
That was
A
2019.
month or two ago.
Oh, that's 2019. Yeah, okay, thank you. But then this other one, I thought might have been in that time frame, but who knows? Yeah, memory. memory is what it is. The square mileage of the cities, which, is an interesting parameter. Albany was listed at 5.5 square miles, and you might not be aware of most of that is water.
Yeah.
You are aware.
I just included total.
Okay. Because I think just for your future analytical skill, probably just doing the land area
Okay.
would be
Thank you.
more, because that goes to the population density, which then goes to opportunity for.
Bigger than El Cerrito.
Yeah, right. Like, woohoo! That was the plan. Fill that bay. That's what previous generations were working on. And it's interesting to see the residential, because, there was a lot of pedestrian traffic. At least, I live on Talbot. There's a lot of pedestrian traffic. And I think in the last meeting, one of the comments in the beginning was, motorists were stopping less and less at four-way stops, which you would think would translate into injuries. Based on your analysis, that doesn't seem to be the case, and that you didn't see a progressive increase in injuries on the residential streets. That may be coming, or it could be, they don't stop, but they're still going slow. So it's, the dynamic is more perceptual than actual, which isn't to discount it, but it's a different kind of a risk.
Maybe your car volumes are exponentially growing on the corridors rather than on the neighborhood streets.
Yeah. Did you, and I get the sense maybe you didn't, but, you did look at some of the collision factors in terms of who was at fault. So you look at the factors of like what movement the vehicle was making. I know when I go into Tim's, you can actually, and you wouldn't do this for all 100 or however many there were, but you can click on the icon and now actually you can get access to a drawing of what was going on at the time. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that for at least the severe ones, and if there was anything that came out of that dramatically.
I did, but I didn't include it into the analysis. But I did notice when it did say if a vehicle was making a left turn and the pedestrian was crossing or things like that.
Yeah, I was surprised to see on your final slide, there it is, Garfield. So Brighton, kind of knew about that one because there's been a lot of left turn from Brighton onto San Pablo accidents. Garfield, I was a little surprised by, and I was surprised not to see Portland here because we've had members of the public saying, well, you got a signal at Brighton, you got a signal at Washington, and you're talking about making improvements to those. You got no signal at Portland, and that's the one I use. So whether there aren't more accidents there because people avoid using it or because it actually isn't as dangerous as it's perceived to be, I don't know, because we don't have volume data. So that's the other thing about these analyses is you never know what the exposure is. Like the one that comes to mind is I think Berkeley has the highest absolute number of bicycle and pedestrian accidents of any city its size in the state. But it also has a lot more people walking and biking. So without that volume data, you can't actually say what the risk is.
Other comments?
I do want to note that Solano at Masonic and Marin at Masonic are on the list of
There you go.
high crash locations, and we're tackling that, so we've picked a good spot to do improvements.
I want to thank you for this presentation. When we see the data that you put up, it's kind of, we get numbers, but it's, we don't know where they are. So this was very helpful for me to sort of conceptualize where problem areas are, and something that jumped out to me. I went through and sort of added up the intersections for the 5 years, and on Solano Avenue, Cornell has the highest number of accidents at that intersection, which is also a school. So maybe we want to think about that. So.
Yeah, actually, when did the parklet go in there? Was that just a year and a half ago?
Probably
ago, yeah.
That,
Not that
not
long
more
ago.
than a couple of years ago.
So really too early to know what, if any, impact that's having one way or the other. But this provides at least a baseline.
It's good. We often ask in this commission, how does Albany compare to other cities? So it's good you made that comparison. I think in addition to the using land square mileage, maybe there's some way to have it all on the same scale. So whether it's per capita or something like that instead of whole numbers or round numbers. It's hard because it's such small numbers compared to population. I guess that's what you would do it to. But still, I think you'd get a better comparison that way.
Thank you.
Well, and you could also use the MTC has a site called Vital Signs, which is the easiest place to access the percent of work commute trips that are completed by different modes.
There you go.
And so that's the best metric I know of for getting some feel for what percentage of people are walking, biking, carpooling, doing other things. And so that'd be another way to take a cut at it. I think that's only current through 2016 maybe, because it's based on the American Community Survey, and I guess maybe that data stream has stopped. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, who knows now?
And just to add for the benchmarking component of this, the county is wrapping up a countywide active transportation plan that does look at high injury networks across the county, and they did do some separating into buckets for the exposure component of it. So once that plan is complete, I think they're going to have material that's relevant city by city that we can bring here, that they could even present here coming up. That would be sort of a complement to this, looking at individual collisions here in Albany.
Great.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, moving on. Maybe a recommendation of staff is to have the interim presentations happen at the beginning of the agenda. You're a trooper.
She wants the experience.
There you go. You got the exposure. You got the exposure. You know, yeah, the full feel of what happens.
Well, we're also going pretty fast tonight.
Yeah, we are not having to extend time. Oh, we should have extended at 9:30, huh? It's okay. All right, shall we move quickly through announcements?
Sure, I can, since there was one on the agenda, new email address, you've already utilized it. Just to reiterate, an email just went out to the liaison, so I'll be forwarding you an email from the city clerk with some details on this, but the email is so that rather than prior emails went to me and I included them in the agenda packet or forwarded them on, depending on the timing of them, people can email you directly. It's emailing tc@albanyca.org, and then it goes to the full commission and staff liaison. It is not restricted from hitting reply all, so please don't do that. For some reason, the technology, you're BCC'd, but able to reply all. We're still looking into that, but it's not preventing a reply all. So please, if you do want to respond directly to the inquirer. We encourage you to copy staff so that we're in the loop as well. But it does allow you all to receive emails without your email address being, posted on the website. With the change, we could change our current practice. We continued with this agenda to post all correspondence that was submitted that way on the agenda items and in public correspondence or public comment. So we could continue to do that. We could decide if we should change that because now people can reach out to you directly in between commission meetings. The other main items that the clerk was wanting to reiterate was if you do respond, you make it clear to the inquirer that you're responding on your behalf unless you've been designated by the full commission to speak for the commission. And there's some other details, just Brown Act related details, and helping keep clear what the response is, and that I'll have, if I respond, I should copy you so that you're not all guessing whether they've been responded to and that kind of thing. So it'll spell out this, and if there are additional questions on that, we can talk about that in the future. And then I think that is.
I mean, it's not on here, but, and so turn me back if it's reasonable, but I think it would be nice to have an announcement on what's going on with the striping.
Sure, there's been some comments on that. The resurfacing is all complete. Striping is mostly complete, I believe, at this point. So all of the ATP striping, I think, is in the ground. They were doing some with noticing for people to remove parking. They were still going into this week, but I think that is mostly done. I've seen posts going up for the signage wayfinding component of the bike routes. So that is, I think, the final step of that. But yeah, they've been installing posts around the city in advance of putting the signs on them.
So is the striping or the paint, thermoplastic, is that just going in where there was resurfacing, or is it whole routes that are being?
No, so it's been a while since we've looked at the plans, but there was a component that was where we were resurfacing. There was a component that was just purely implementing ATP signage and striping beyond what roads were getting resurfaced. So there are some applications that are on, rougher surfaces or whatever, but it was to roll out the rest of the striping.
It's the whole thing. Okay. Okay, thanks.
All right, future agenda items?
We have Albany High School loading zones coming. It just went to the district, the school board. They were wanting to present at their school board and give opportunity for an additional community input before they brought it here, but they have completed that now, so they should be done continuing the item and presenting next month.
Can staff forward Commissioner McCroskey's comments to?
Yes, we will forward the comments. We also have Public Works should be ready to bring Albany pavement program back for discussion around future candidate streets, I believe, next month. We might be bringing some traffic calming discussion items. We're looking at both some more recent data collection as well as more of continuing to work on the policy side and get more information on potential revisions to our traffic calming policy.
I will ask once again for standards. And keep beating that drum.
Good. Yep.
We'll pass on your request to the city engineer.
You said they are likely to be here next month, so maybe that provides some a benefit of reducing overhead.
Yeah, they're just awfully busy right now,
Sure.
tearing up Solano Avenue and putting it back together again.
Little things.
As well as preparing for the meeting itself. So we'll let him know, and I'm sure if he's got the time to do it, he will. But when we talked about it the other day, I'm not sure that they're ready.
I mean, I don't know that there's much necessarily prep for him to do for it. It's just, I don't know.
I think if he's going to do it, I think he really wants to put some energy into it.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Yeah, he's like that. I appreciate that about him very much, so.
Okay. All right, item 8, next meeting is Thursday, July 25th. I will finish this sentence here.
Will everybody be here? Or?
Yeah, we can take a little straw poll of who's available and not. I think I'll be here. You sure?
Yeah, I'll be here. Okay.
Good.
I will not, so. But I will be up here till the week before, so you can continue to work through me, but if it's the final week, then make sure to copy Jeff.
Yeah, please. If there's a last minute thing, please let me know. That'd be great.
Sounds good. All right, and we are adjourned. Thank you.